Welcome to the Equipping You in Grace podcast. We are so excited that you are joining us for the show today. This podcast aims to explore a biblical life view in a conversational tone. Let's join our host and founder of Servants of Grace, Dave Jenkins, for today's episode. Thanks so much for listening.
Welcome back to the Equipping You in Grace podcast. My name is Dave, and I'm the host for this podcast, and today I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Kruger. Dr. Kruger, welcome to the Equipping You in Grace podcast.
Yeah, happy to be with you today.
Yeah, can you please tell us about your life, marriage, ministry, and some of the current ministry projects that you're working on, sir?
Well, yeah, so currently I'm the president and professor of New Testament at Reformed Theological Seminary here in Charlotte, North Carolina. Been here almost 18 years, married to Melissa, and have 3 children. I don't know what other questions you had in there, but that's the quick summary of who I am and what I'm up to.
Yeah, any other book projects that you're working on?
Oh, I've got several book projects that I'm always busy with. My most recent book, of course, we'll discuss, which is Christianity at the Crossroads, and many of my sort of follow-up interviews and discussions have been focused on that book, but I'm working on a few other things right now, and including a book on preparing folks to enter college, university environments as a believer is one of the major projects I'm working on.
Oh, that sounds really helpful. Look forward to reading that. And before we get into talking about your book, I just want to say thank you for writing so well on the particular topic that we're going to talk about today. I've read multiple of your books and have greatly enjoyed them. So thank you, sir.
Yeah, well, glad to hear that. Glad they've been helpful.
Definitely. Can you please tell us about your latest book? As you mentioned, it's titled Christianity at the Crossroads, How the Second Century Shaped the Future of the Church, why you wrote it, and how it's being received.
Yeah, well, for those of you who might know, those of your listeners who might know some of my other writings, the second century is a century I've worked on from a number of different angles, including looking at the state of the Canon and state of the New Testament text and other things like that. And it became clear to me over the years that the New Testament canon and text, sort of their core sort of time of development, was really a second century time. In fact, if you look at the scope of modern scholarship, there's quite a wide recognition that the second century was a critical time of formation for the early church. That many of the challenges faced then, many of the obstacles the church had to overcome during that century would sort of shape the church and determine who and what the church would be for generations to come. And so it was a critical century in the history of early Christianity. But at the same time, it was very clear as I did my research that there's very little that had been written about it, at least as a century. Certainly people have talked about aspects of the second century, but there are very few books that actually are written just about that century and are designed to explain it and unpack it. So this book was designed to fill a scholarly gap of some sorts and to help people realize that this really is a key part of understanding how we got to where we are today. And so cover a lot of ground in the book, all the way from sort of transitions out of Judaism to interactions with the Greco-Roman world to the development of text and canon during this time period. So I hope it's been helpful for people.
Yeah, definitely. I really enjoyed, as I mentioned earlier, reading it. And I'm fascinated by church history and all of these things. I have been since high school. So these books are right up my nerd alley, if you will. So thank you for satisfying my theological nerd.
Anytime.
Right. So why should Christians today be concerned about the second century Christianity?
Well, it's interesting when you look back on other phases of the modern church, even 50 years ago in the West, even 50 years ago in the United States, if someone would have asked a Christian, which early century of the church do you feel like you can relate to the most? I imagine most people would probably pick something like the 4th or 5th century, because in the 4th or 5th century, the empire was largely Christianized, and many people were followers of the Christian religion, and that's very much the way the United States has been for a long time. There's some similarities there, but in the last 10 years or so, that's shifted, and I think one of the reasons the second century is becoming more relevant, if you will, is because we have a lot more in common with it. Now that we live in a post-Christian world, we find ourselves very much the cultural minority, very much under attack, very much looked at negatively from the cultural elites, and very much find ourselves in a hostile environment. And those are all the same things that the Christians face in the second century. They were the religion, if you will, that was disdained and looked down upon by the Greco-Roman world. They were persecuted and maligned and attacked philosophically and politically. And it was a time I think we can learn a lot from. There's a lot in common there between the 2nd century and our 21st century environment. So I think part of the interest in this time period for people probably will be realizing, wow, there's a bit of a mirror here. There's a bit of an echo. We can see what happened there and what Christians did there. It can teach us a lot about how we can interact with our culture today.
Yeah, what do you think are maybe just 2 or 3 points on that? How does the 2nd century interact with the 21st century? How would that help Christians?
Well, I think one way it helps is to recognize that the same reason Christians were persecuted in the ancient world is the same reason that they are today. And the reason that matters is because there's a certain sense of continuity that reminds us of that things haven't changed for Christianity for 2,000 years. And more than that the hostility we feel from our culture is exactly what it was in the earliest times. And that reason, if you will, for why Christianity was attacked in the 2nd century was fundamentally about its exclusivity, that Christians refused to participate in the worship of the Roman gods, that they would not worship any other god other than Christ. And that exclusivity was the sticking point. In the modern day, people are tempted to abandon that sticking point because it causes so many problems. They're thinking, well, maybe we can find a way around that. But what I think we can learn from the 2nd century is that that's not the solution. The solution isn't just abandoning parts of our faith that the culture finds offensive, but to recognize that some things are non-negotiables and that we need to ride out whatever cultural phase we're in and not compromise on those points.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Why is it essential that we understand the concept of canon, what counts as canon in early Christianity?
Well, this is, of course, part of this book, but also part of many of the other things I've written. One of the perennial questions for early Christians is, what authority did they use? What sources did they read and appeal to? And how does that help us understand how we got our Bibles? And, many people have this impression that the canon, the collection of books we have today for our New Testaments was something that was assembled much later. They think that it was the 4th or 5th century, that was the time when the church finally settled on these things and picked books, so to speak, and that most reconstructions of this typically pinned on Constantine, as if Constantine somehow decided the canon in this time period. But what I think is important about the 2nd century is it reminds us that Christians were already using books of Scripture from our New Testaments back at that point, and that there was already a burgeoning collection, a core set of books, if you will, that Christians were using as Scripture, even at this early juncture. And that tells you something. It tells you that these books didn't need to be validated by a later church council. It tells you that Christians did know, largely at least, what to read and not to read in these early centuries. They did understand what books were Scripture as a whole. We tend to think it was a later formalized process when apparently it was a much more natural, organic process. And I think that's important for people to understand.
Yeah, it definitely is. Why was, I'm probably going to butcher his name, but correct me if I'm wrong here, please. Why was Marcion's teaching so dangerous?
Yeah, so for your listeners, they may not know who the figure Marcion is. Marcion was a very well-known 2nd century Christian, or at least professing Christian, perhaps is maybe the better way to say it, who got associated with the church in Rome and actually gave a big financial gift to the church in Rome. And then after he had sort of acquired a place of influence, started to teach things that were contrary to what core Christian doctrines had always affirmed. And what he effectively taught is that the Old Testament needs to be cut away. And he thought it was completely antithetical and out of sync with the pure gospel that the Apostle Paul had delivered to the church. And so he saw Paul on the one side and his pure salvation by grace alone, etc. And then he saw the Old Testament and thought, well, that's a barbaric, legalistic works arrangement. And in fact, so upset was Marcion with the Old Testament that he actually assumed and presumed that it must have been written, must have been inspired by a false God, that there was another God actually that's behind the Old Testament, and that the real God, the true God, Jesus, is actually the God behind the New Testament. So there's a bit of a Gnostic flavor about Marcion. He's not a Gnostic, but there was a Gnostic sense about him that caused a lot of problems in early Christianity. He was eventually rejected and condemned as a heretic. In fact, most people look at Marcion as sort of the arch heretic of early Christianity. He's the classic example of someone who sort of lost his theological way, if you will. And so he's always standing there as a lesson for us.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So, we kind of have set the foundation to ask this question, to bring it really into our day. I know that you've written a lot on Andy Stanley. You've reviewed his latest book recently at TGC. What is your goal in writing about him so much, and what concerns you most about the trajectory of his teaching?
Yeah, so Andy Stanley just came out with a book called Irresistible. As I said in my review, there's many things about it I appreciate. I particularly appreciate the whole idea behind the book, which is let's find a way to reach the next generation generation with the gospel, and let's if we can remove as many obstacles as we're able to do to keep people from believing. And I want to commend Stanley for that. I think it's clear he has a heart for the lost, and he thinks a lot about it. And I would say that most pastors in our nation today could take a lesson from him there. We need to think more about how to reach folks for Christ. That said, I did disagree significantly with the thesis of the book and made that clear in the review. Effectively, Stanley argues that the biggest obstacle for non-Christians is for one, the truth of the Bible, but in particular the problems of the Old Testament. He finds the Old Testament to be a major stumbling block for people. And so he ends up arguing effectively in the book that the Old Testament is out of sync with the New Covenant in such a way that we ought to stop using it. And when he says it, he means the Old Testament. Stop really using it as a basis for what we think and believe and act, how we act as Christians. I find that to be, deeply problematic on a number of theological levels. And so in my review, I pushed back and said, look, we can't do that. I don't think the New Testament writers do that. Are there certain things that are abrogated from the Old Covenant? Of course. We're not offering animal sacrifices. We're not looking to a particular plot of land in a physical temple. And Stanley's exactly right about that. But I think he pushes the contrast so far that there ends up effectively making the two covenants antithetical to each other. And I think that that's not necessarily the way the New Testament presents it.
I think what concerns me so much about this, and your answer is excellent, is Andy is a very good communicator. He is very clear. So that tells me and other people that he means what he says. As you said, he's a very thoughtful person and thinker and those kind of things. So I think what he's saying he actually means, because that's what he actually thinks. And I know that recently he's kind of backed off some of the statements, it seems like, that he's tried to say and walk them back a little bit. But I think that that's not really where he's at. I think that being that he's so clear, and of course I want to be charitable and give the benefit of the doubt, but when somebody like that, who is a clear thinker and communicator, comes out and says the kind of things that he does, I think that it's fair to say that he means that.
Yeah, it's hard to know what a person means sometimes, isn't it? This is really the second thing I've reviewed from Stanley. I reviewed a lengthy sermon a couple years ago he preached on the Scripture, and then now the book. And so, when it comes to a book review, all you have is the book. I mean, when you review something, you're not able to necessarily listen to everything a person says in every context. So, it's hard to know how he qualifies things and maybe modifies things in other contexts. But as far as the book goes, which is all I was dealing with, there remains some real challenges there that I think we have to take a closer look at.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And I just want to be on the record with you on that and say I haven't listened or read everything that he's put out there for sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure it'd be possible to do so.
I'm not an Andy, but I will say I'm not an Andy Stanley fan. So that's probably another reason I haven't listened to his sermons and those kind of things. But what I've heard really concerns me when he's made statements about, for example, expository preaching, unhitching the Old Testament from the Bible, and those kind of statements. It concerns me, makes me not want to consider what he has to say. And so I guess this is really where we're going with this kind of conversation. How should Christians respond to Andy Stanley? How should we think about this?
Well, of course, that's part of the reason I wrote the review, is to help Christians know how to think about it. My conclusion from the review is I think that the idea that we should just cut off the Old Testament like that is out of sync with the history of Christianity, and I think out of sync even with the way the New Testament treats the Old Testament. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of good things you can learn from Stanley, and a lot of helpful things about the way he does have a heart for non-Christians that I think can still be a good lesson for people that need to take that to heart and really think about what are we doing, what are we considering as we try to reach the next generation, and every generation is different. But at the end of the review, there's just some things that are not negotiable. There's certain things that you just can't compromise on. You can't take away, regardless of how offensive they are to people. When it comes to the truth of the Old Testament, I think that's one of the things that you just can't negotiate away. I think it matters whether it's true. Jesus thought it was true. If Jesus was wrong about it, then there's obviously that creates some serious problems for what we believe.
Yeah, absolutely. You're an expert, or maybe the expert, I don't know, in this field. And so some people I've seen and heard, maybe not as explicit in so many words, but the idea is that he might be either at or have gone towards Marcion theology. Would you agree with that assessment? How would you respond to that kind of idea?
Yeah, I think it's a mix. It depends what part you're comparing them to. I mentioned Marcion in my book review, and I think if you're asking the question of comparing him to the early views of church history, then this issue is going to come up. One of the interesting things is he looked at the early patristic writers and said they were mistaken about the way to look at the Old Testament. And I just simply pointed out that the person who does agree with Stanley from early Christianity about his view of the Old Testament is actually Marcion, and that they agree in the sense that they think Paul's gospel is not squarable and does not fit with the Old Covenant system. And so in that sense, there are similarities. But I also said very plainly in my review that there was also significant differences. And anytime you make a comparison, it's important that you qualify it. Marcion was a heretic in the full sense of the word and very much rejected the God of the Old Testament. And I want to make it clear that that's not what Stanley's saying. Stanley affirms the inspiration of the Old Testament and does not argue that it's a different God, and certainly would reject Marcion. So whenever you compare someone with an historical figure, it's complex. But there are similarities, and like I said, I pointed those out in my review.
What do you think some of the biggest, kind of going back to your book a little bit, what do you think are some of the most significant issues facing studies on the canon today?
Well, that's a broad question. There's all kinds of challenges that come up when it comes to studies on the canon today. People still struggle with this question of lost books and apocryphal books and books that didn't make it in to the canon, and we always are discovering these sorts of books and these sorts of writings, and there's new discoveries all the time that I think continue to rattle people's cages, and so that continues to be an issue. The other reality is that the critical scholars are always talking about canon issues, and they're talking about them not just to fellow academics but to lay people, and so there's always that reality that the lay people in our churches are going to continue to be bombarded with these themes, and so we've got to be ready to answer these sorts of questions to help people know that the Bible is the way it is for a reason, and that those are good reasons.
Yeah. So just as we land the plane today, sir, for this conversation, what would you have Christians think about or take away as they go ahead and pick up your book, Christianity at the Crossroads?
Yeah, so I hope that in many ways they can be encouraged. The second century was a time where the church faced a tremendous amount of opposition, significant persecution. They were still finding their way, so to speak. And at least from a human perspective, it wasn't at all clear they were going to make it. Now, from a divine perspective, of course, we would say it was clear. But from a human perspective, it was not clear they were going to make it. And things looked pretty grim. And what I think Christians can be encouraged by is that even in the midst of that very tumultuous situation, that God preserved his church and kept her faithful over many, many years. And that happened not because she compromised with the culture, but because she stayed true to what she believed. And that can be a motivation today, that even when the church finds itself in a hostile world, that we want to continue to just faithfully teach and preach Christ and worship him, and not feel the need to change what we believe in order to make it more accommodating to the world that we find ourselves in.
Well, Dr. Kruger, I just want to say thank you for answering my sometimes very challenging questions, and for providing very thoughtful and careful answers, pastoral answers to them. So I want to thank you for that, sir, and just thankful for your writing ministry and what you're doing there.
Appreciate it. Good to be with you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much for listening. We hope that you were encouraged by today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcast. For more uplifting and thought-provoking content, please visit us online at servantsofgrace.org. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Servants of Grace, and on Facebook at facebook.com/servantsofgrace. We hope you have a blessed day, and we will see you next time.